The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Famed war correspondent Edward R. Murrow once said, "Our major obligation is not to mistake slogans for solutions." How well he predicted the present condition of the not-so-illustrious Fourth Estate. With media denizens choosing soundbites over substance and a willful disregard for balance in their reportage, it is us, you and I, the consumers, who are obligated to sift through the nonsense to find the nuggets of truth in a mine shaft stuffed to the brim with falsity. And that's just what we're going to do on this episode of Liberty Nation Radio, right here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and on today's edition, we're going to be examining the sloganeering of the left-leaning media and politicians as they try to hang Governor Andrew Cuomo out to dry. We'll also be speaking with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst, Tim Donner, on blatant displays of politics that we've been witnessing in this year's Olympic Games and why the media seems so keen to promote it. Also on the show, we have author and podcaster Jeff Charles to discuss Black Lives Matter and the oh-so-politicized Tokyo Games. And we'll be chatting with Economist Andrew Moran to dig deep into the costs, benefits, and returns of hosting an Olympic shindig. All this coming up and a whole lot more. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. So, the question on everyone's lips is, how long can New York Governor Andrew Cuomo hold on in light of the Attorney General Office's report that concludes he not only sexually harassed 11 former and present staffers, but also retaliated against one of the ladies who tried to go public? AG Letitia James says that her office is not pressing charges, but that other law enforcement agencies are open to do so. Concluding her scathing press conference to announce the release of the report, AG James felt that the perfect summary to her, let's call it a political assassination, was to proclaim, "Believe all women." Now, it's a slogan that we've heard for a while now, and one that came to prominence during the Harvey Weinstein Me Too campaign and Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing. But what does it really mean? Well, surprisingly, there's quite a bit of debate over that. You see, originally the phrase was "believe women," which linguistic acrobats later explained meant merely that the statement of a woman should be treated with the same validity as that of a man. For those of you not on the radical feminist left, you may have assumed that this was already the case. America is not, after all, an Islamic nation where the testimony of a woman is worth half that of a man. Of course, one explanation for that practice is that the Quran was implying that expert testimony is worth more than that of an unskilled witness. It's an idea which, of course, comes with its own set of sexist issues. But that's not something that happens in the United States. And then came "believe all women." The transformation, much as the left would like to claim came from the political right, did in fact come from the left when doubts were raised about certain allegations. And it seems that opting for sloganeering over substance has made a once rallying call into little more than a joke. Certainly, every single accusation against now Justice Brett Kavanaugh was believed hook, line, and sinker by those who wanted to believe, even when all evidence pointed to the contrary. But when President Joe Biden was accused of misconduct by Tara Reade, this clarion call was conveniently ignored. Same goes for the accusers of Bill Clinton, but not, of course, for the accusers of President Donald Trump. His accusers must always be believed and treated with credulity. When the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, a woman whose sights appear set far higher than her present position of prominence, summarizes her explosive report with the words, "Believe all women," this really should send shivers down its spine. Her office is a law-based position, and to engage in sloganeering, it smacks of political posturing far more than of doing her job. An attorney general of any political stripe should not be saying, believe all women. They should be saying, believe the evidence, believe the carefully investigated reports, the documents, the affidavits, the statements, and the evidence that we have gathered and triple checked for validity. But of course, that doesn't roll off the tongue quite so easily. It makes one wonder if this investigation into Governor Cuomo, whether he's guilty or not, is more the political witch hunt designed to remove a popular competitor and to boost the standing of someone who actually wants the top job. Or at least that's the conclusion of Governor Cuomo himself. With the release of the damning report, Mr. Cuomo's legal team responded quickly with a report of their own in which they attacked the probe for its process, its unwillingness to follow the evidence trail, and its bias. In fact, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the conclusion was written by President Donald Trump himself. It reads, quote, "The report ignored key facts and pieces of evidence that undermine many of those allegations, and the press conference confirmed that this investigation had a predetermined outcome regardless of all the evidence," end quote. And yes, it uses quotes around the word investigation. Is Team Cuomo admitting that Democrats use investigations that are without merit to try and take down political opponents? Well, for those of us who paid attention to two impeachments, numerous committees, and are now following Nancy Pelosi's January 6th Select Committee, this comes as no shock whatsoever. Let's talk about another slogan for a moment, witch hunt. Derided by all on the political left, whenever President Trump claimed something was a witch hunt, he was mocked, he was called paranoid, he was accused of trying to deflect attention from another scandal. But let's examine that briefly. The Russian collusion scandal, kept high in the media for years, a major source of fundraising for the Democrats. It all turned out to be nothing, based on a single dossier, which was the product of opposition research, paid for in part by the DNC and Hillary Clinton. Witch hunt, yes or no? Witch hunts happen, and they happen on the political left a lot. Perhaps Governor Cuomo will see the light and realize that the pervasive culture of empty slogans and political backstabbings are part and parcel of a party that he has represented and supported for so many years. So what's next for Andrew Cuomo? He's lost the support of his party leadership. President Biden lamented to the TV cameras present and said that he should resign. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who's been a family friend of the Cuomos for more than 4 decades, also joined the chorus, saying that he should respect the office that he holds and the state that he loves, and demanded his resignation, as did New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and both New York Senators Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand. And a prominent state assembly member said that she had had the articles of impeachment already drafted months ago, just waiting and waiting. With no major support in the Empire State, it seems that even if Cuomo does hang on, which seems to be his intent, his career is in its waning days. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not going to do it again," he said in a prepared video release, explaining that the people who thought he was out of line were either misinterpreting his actions or just plain lying about them. And this line may be enough to keep him going. To resign could, of course, be seen as an admission of guilt. Either way, his term of governor ends on January the 1st, 2023. And that could be the end of the road, or it might not. The question now is if his continued governorship will be a thorn in the side of the Democratic Party, and whether or not Republicans will exploit this political gift. The swiftness with which his former allies cut him adrift perhaps displays the adage that no one is bigger than the party. By sacrificing the man who was once touted as a political savior of the party, the leadership can claim the moral high ground on this issue and show that they acted swiftly and decisively. But that leaves another lingering question. What if he's innocent of the charges? Cuomo is nothing if not a brawler. He still has enough political clout to fight the charges. And in his case, many members of the press might listen to his protests that this is in fact a witch hunt. He'll certainly receive a fairer shot than Donald Trump ever got. So what if he does manage to cast enough doubt on the allegations made by Attorney General Letitia James? He could easily spin this into an underdog situation whereby a party in the grips of virtue signaling obsession requires rescue, thereby placing himself squarely in the winning position. And God help those who kicked him on his way down. We'll be right back on Liberty Nation after this very short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Well, with the Olympics in full flow, the question of patriotism once more raises its head. It seems that large swaths of the population are only ever patriotic about their nation when the party they vote for is in power. Or is it more like what Mark Twain once wrote? Patriotism to your country always, patriotism to your government only when it deserves it. So what is the state of play for patriotism in the United States right now? The country is still rebuilding after the violent summer of love, and some say things just can't be or shouldn't be rebuilt at all. To help us tackle this timely issue, we're speaking with Jeff Charles, Liberty Nation author and podcaster. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, great to be here.
So, Jeff, give us your diagnosis. How is patriotism in America today, and has 2020's events improved or lessened the sense of patriotism?
My diagnosis is that it's the same as it was before this summer of love. I mean, people who were patriotic before the riots and all of, that nonsense, they're still just as patriotic as they were today. I don't think it really moved the needle. And people who were not patriotic still have the same attitudes. Now we do see the left trying to decrease the level of patriotism because it's, how they intend to reach their Marxist, objectives. But I don't think the needle has been moved on patriotism very significantly.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that there's certain objectives behind denigrating patriotism, because in the United Kingdom, where I live, we had the opposition leader recently try and use patriotism, and it was part of a big open campaign where the leader of the party, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, which is the equivalent of the Democratic Party in America, he says, what we should do to try and reach out to voters is appear more patriotic. And so they started. It was so cringeworthy that this was somebody who would look on at distaste at an English flag prior to deciding it was politically expedient to embrace patriotism for a short time. That lasted about 2 weeks, I'll have you know. Anyway, it seems to me that there are a lot of people making a lot of money from doing down the United States, whether that's political donations, as you just pointed to. But it seems to me that sponsorships, especially advertising gigs and cold hard cash, are rolling in for those who are willing to talk down the stars and the stripes. Especially so for those who are involved in the Olympics right now. How has this become so profitable?
Yeah, I call it virtue signaling for dollars. That's what we're seeing with a lot of this woke corporatism that's been, kind of going on over the past few years. I had a conversation with Will Hild, who heads the consumers research, and they have a campaign that's being launched against this. And it's interesting because I've always believed that they're embracing this wokeness because it gets them in good with consumers and they avoid the wrath of the woke mob. And I still believe that, but he brought up another interesting perspective that they're engaging in all this wokeness to distract from the malfeasance that a lot of these corporations are involved in, especially ones that rely on forced labor in China or are guilty of abusing their consumers in other ways. So I think overall, it's just a benefit for a lot of these corporations to embrace wokeness. This isn't a case of them bowing to the woke mob. They're not being forced to do this. They see an opportunity, so they're taking advantage of it.
That's a very interesting perspective, especially when you consider that many of the products that we get, especially fast fashion products, they come out of the Xinjiang region or near the Xinjiang region. There's obviously the new legislation was just going through Congress recently that said that products will be barred from Xinjiang region, which just means that there's a lot of work for truck drivers for the 5 miles just outside the border of Xinjiang. A lot of new jobs created there for heavy trucks and tuk-tuk drivers, which are very popular over there. Now, not being an American, it strikes me as almost bizarre that there are some folks so against the United States of America. Now, this is America is the only country in the world that has the right to free speech enshrined and inviolate in its constitution. And that, to me, it's an amazing thing. And for me, that's what really represents America. And I'm sure that's true for many people around the world, especially as we've seen in recent weeks with Cuba and in a few months back in Hong Kong, where these protesters, they're carrying the American flag. And that really has been a huge symbol for all of my adult life, at least. So when people speak against America, obviously they're using their First Amendment right, which is wonderful to do so. But what do they hope to achieve? What is it that they want?
Yeah, so, I mean, here's what I'll say. I mean, America is the greatest nation on earth, but we are not without flaws, right? I mean, there are still issues that still need to be addressed in order to ensure a more perfect union. I think a lot of these people genuinely want to address the problems that we have. And whether or not I agree with the solutions that they come up with, I think that that's a good thing. However, you also have people who want to use America's problems and its flaws to entirely remake the nation into their own image. And that's what I was alluding to earlier when I talked about the Marxist agenda here, the objectives they want to accomplish. They want to remake America into a more socialist nation. I mean, former President Barack Obama even alluded to that when he said, we are going to fundamentally transform America. Not just deal with these problems, but remake the entire nation into something that doesn't even resemble what it is right now. So there's a difference between those who just want to figure out solutions to problems and others who just want to scrap the whole thing and turn it into something else. And that's why they foment a lot of this anti-American sentiment, because if they can get more Americans to dislike our country, then they will be more amenable to the idea that, hey, America is hopelessly flawed, hopelessly racist, hopelessly whatever. We need a complete overhaul. And that's really where they're trying to go with this.
It's funny how so few Americans are fleeing to other countries.
Yeah, you don't get a lot of them, especially the ones who are complaining the most about it.
Yeah.
If you could ask them, they wouldn't rather live anywhere else.
Now, Jeff, we can't avoid the topic of the Olympics. So when a major sporting event like the Olympics takes place, we often get a sense of coming together, of, you know, we're one nation and this is our team and we're supporting. So it's that kind of attitude. Now, are you feeling that with the Olympic Games?
You know, I haven't watched the Olympics in years, but I do see that they're trying to introduce more of that wokeness that I was talking about before. Like they want to hone in on the problems America has instead of focusing on what's great. I mean, when you go international and you're competing in international events, that's not really the time to down your own country. However, I still think that we run the risk of overblowing this, because I still think the majority of our athletes are there to represent a country that they're proud of. And even though they may acknowledge certain problems, they're there to represent the red, white, and blue. So I don't think that it's having as big of an effect as it might seem, but it is still an issue that we should pay attention to.
Jeff Charles, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back after this short break on Liberty Nation Radio.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Now, putting aside the issue of politics and patriotism in the Olympic Games for the moment, what about the costs associated with them? It's widely circulated that hosting the Games is a big draw in terms of bringing cash revenue into the country. But is it really worth it? Can the government justify the enormous costs associated with hosting the event to the taxpayer? Well, to answer these questions, we're joined by economics guru Andrew Moran to delve deeper into the numbers and the political morality of just such an investment. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So first question, Andrew, how much do these games actually set back the taxpayer, and what's the reward ratio for them?
You know, I remember for years, everyone was so gung-ho about hosting the Olympics. Everyone was clamoring for the summer and winter games and all these other international events like FIFA. Nowadays, you know, the only people who want these things are the politicians and the participants, maybe because all the attention you get from these ribbon-cutting ceremonies and all the spending you get of taxpayer dollars. You know, it's like a kid in a candy store for a lot of these politicians and bureaucrats. But nowadays, the average person, they just shrug at all these, at just the prospect of hosting these things. And, you know, it's the main thing, as you said, it's all about the cost borne on the taxpayer. Just to bid for these things requires tens of millions of dollars. I was reading the other day that Tokyo had a budget of 75 million just to put a bid on hosting the 2020 Olympic Games. Overall, you know, every single event that you've seen, it's always bloated budgets, and, you know, these countries are saddled with debts. In my home country, Canada, in Montreal, they hosted the 1976 Summer Olympics, which was, you know, 12 years before I was born. But when you look at the data, they found that they took on about $1.5 billion of debt, and they only paid it off 30 years later. Beijing, they spent $40 billion in 2008. Brazil spent $20 billion in 2016. South Korea doubled its budget on the 2018 games. It just never ended with all of this spending. So, you know, for the cost to the taxpayer, it's always billions of dollars, and then generations later still have to pay for it.
And that's not including the actual VIG on the loans as well. So,
yeah,
Andrew,
exactly. Yeah.
What are the sources of revenue for the host nations here? Now, we've heard about the benefits and how they accrue over a period of years, several years. So it's not as though the 2020 games, which of course are taking place in 2021, the revenue is supposed to come in not just for this year, but for several years after. I mean, how realistic is that?
I've seen studies that show that those things for the Olympics, it's a one-time cash injection. The tourism dollars are enormous. There's no doubt about that. People obviously are going to watch fencing and table tennis at these events. So it gives the restaurants and hotels a boost. But at this point, you're just subsidizing restaurants for this little short-term gain. Overall, it's not realistic. You know, if somebody's traveling, say, Rio de Janeiro, they're not going to say, I should travel to Rio de Janeiro because, wow, they hosted the Olympic Games a few years ago. And then if someone can make the case, well, the infrastructure that they built for the Olympics, that's going to stand tall. But then you look at other countries that have done it. These stadiums, they're dilapidating. Beijing, they have these ghost towns of all these Olympic venues. You know, I will give credit to Ontario though. Ontario here, when we hosted the Pan Am Games, they propped up some of these infrastructure, some of these buildings that house the athletes, and they're still being used today. So that was one example, but they still went over a budget. So, but overall, you know, in Tokyo's case, since there's not going to be any spectators, I think the Tokyo Olympic Games, they're going to lose, I think as high as, estimate I saw as high as $23 billion. This is everything from the loss of household consumption, the loss in tourism dollars, a lack of job creation, and then all the government investments that went into to an event that's now essentially going to be a waste. So Tokyo is not going to gain anything from this whatsoever. And one more thing. If you want to travel to Tokyo, people love Tokyo. People love Tokyo before the Olympic Games. So to use that as a justification for the Olympics is just asinine at this point.
Andrew, digging deeper into the motivations of this, certainly great concepts that unite people are of benefit. I mean, I'm thinking of like the space race, for example. This was something that pulled the nation together and gave everybody a singular purpose that they didn't even know they had before. But is this really on the same level? How can a nation so deep in debt justify spending taxpayer cash on what's essentially just a glory product?
Yeah, I think that's the key word, glory project, because I think for the politicians, So in Tokyo's spending about $15 billion to host this thing. That's what the politicians are looking at. That's what the bureaucrats are seeing. It's a public works scheme that, again, will eventually skyrocket. But when you compare these major points in time to, let's say, the space race, I remember reading years ago, economist Walter Block, and he was talking about how the space race and the moon landing was such a waste of money that it was essentially a boondoggle, because you could have better used those resources and cash on investing in rocket technology and other developmental technologies that we enjoy today. So, for these things, do they unite people? I don't necessarily think so. In the United States, just from a fiscal standpoint, you have $28 trillion in debt. You have the record federal deficits. You have, $4 trillion, $5 trillion a year spending going on. What's funny is that the U.S. spends so much money that hosting the Olympics would be a drop in the bucket. But if in such a fractured society, would the Olympics really benefit anybody? Would people unite? Would the left and right unite? It's highly doubtful. These things have already become politicized. You have pundits who write 2,000-word diatribes on how a little, act is white supremacist or racist or homophobic or some nonsense like that. I know if Canada were to host the Olympics again, like they did in 2010, I know I wouldn't be, I wouldn't feel great about it. I wouldn't be united with my fellow Canadians.
So, Andrew, as a libertarian, and I'm outing you here on radio, as a libertarian, is there a case to be made for privatizing the Olympic Games, maybe looking at a direct sponsorship model?
Yeah, sure. I'd go with privatizing the Olympics. If Amazon or Walmart or any of these multinational corporations want to bid for the Olympics and build this massive infrastructure without taxpayers having to pay for it, sure, go right ahead. I don't really care. But at the same time, there is some corporate sponsorship going on in Tokyo. I think about $4 billion of the overall spending is coming from the private sector. Sponsorships, tickets, and merchandise. So you already do have some private sector funding going on. But the larger costs, they're always being thrusted upon the taxpayers for something that most people will not attend. So in the end, let the market dictate it. Is there an appetite for the Olympics? Do people want to see the Olympics? Then go right ahead. Because corporations can come together. A private version of the Olympics can be established. Stop fleecing the taxpayers for these things.
Many thanks to Mr. Andrew Moran.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
It's been quite the Olympic season over in Tokyo, but it seems not quite the entire world is as captivated by this year's games as would normally be expected, especially coming out of such a troubling COVID-centric season. Why the apathy? Could it be that the politicization of the games, whether a real feature or one ramped up and amplified by a fourth estate desperate to display its virtue, has turned viewers off? As Liberty Nation senior political analyst, former host of Liberty Nation Radio, and a man who has attended no less than 4 Olympic Games, there's no one better placed to answer these questions than Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome, Tim.
Great to be here, Mark.
So, Tim, with the viewing figures down by roughly half since the 2016 Games in Rio, what's making people tune out in their droves?
Well, Mark, I've thought deeply about this at a metaphysical level. And what I've come up with is that maybe, just maybe, people are not tuning in because it's still called the 2020 Olympics when it's 2021. And maybe they think they're watching replays of stuff they missed last summer when everything went crazy with the pandemic. Maybe they thought, the 2020 Olympics happened. Now they're repeating them. It's old news.
They think it's the Winter Games or something.
There's an effect, too, like in Major League Baseball in 2020. No fans create not a very good atmosphere for television either. You add to that the political overlay, just like in the NFL and the NBA. Mark, I think what's most sort of revealing about this year is the contrast from 1968, Mexico City Olympics. John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their hands in a Black Power salute as they accepted Olympic medals. And that was a huge national scandal. It destroyed Carlos and Smith from that point forward. This year, Gwen Berry, the hammer thrower, does essentially the same thing, and basically just a sort of a sidebar story. People aren't paying that much attention. There's no national outrage. So from 1968 to 2021, things have changed a lot. And I think that's largely due to the political climate, where something like what Gwen Berry did this year is sort of to be expected, where in 1968 it was a huge scandal.
Well, I think actually she's probably going to benefit from that in terms of endorsements, sponsorship, deals, things like this. She'll certainly, I mean, she's a very impressive athlete, but I think she'll be getting even better equipment paid for because of her political stances now. Now, Tim, I can't help feeling that the media has played a huge role in this. You can't read a paper or turn on the TV without seeing a story about the race of the athletes or how amazing it is to have such a diverse Team US. What's the obsession?
Well, Mark, why should the Olympics be different than anything else? I mean, there's a total obsession with race in the elite media. So why should the Olympics be any different? I mean, there's always victims of oppression to magnify. When there's 33 sports and about 340 total medal events, there's athletes who could overcome even the systemic racism of their native land. So there's always a diversity story to be had if that's the angle you're looking for. But I will say, in contrast, how about Tamira Mensah-Stock, who wrapped herself in the American flag after winning a gold medal in women's wrestling and talked about how awesome it was. She said she freaking loves living in the U.S. I mean, that's such a contrast to what we've seen. And I think that's what people are looking for in the Olympics and in the coverage of the Olympics, something to feel good about their country. They don't want to be reminded of everything that the elite media and the left thinks is wrong with this country. And I think, look, that has to play into the ratings, which are down so dramatically.
Almost certainly. I mean, of course, this isn't, as you mentioned earlier, this isn't the only Olympic Games that has had a politically charged angle. Care to give us a little history lesson, Tim?
Well, for years, and the expression still lives, the Russian judges say, Soviet judges. I mean, the judging for so many years during the Cold War until the collapse of the Soviet Union was so weighted, so biased, so transparent. Soviet judges would give huge scores to Soviet and Eastern European athletes and give low scores, obviously too low, to American and Western athletes. And that thing carried on for years, really, until the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990 or 91. But you go back to 1968, we mentioned John Carlos, Tommy Smith with a Black Power salute at the Olympics. 1972, the Munich massacre. 11 Israeli athletes, coaches, judges murdered by anti-Israeli terrorists. 1976, the boycotts of South Africa during the Olympics. Then you had the competing boycotts of 1980 and 84. The 80 Olympics in Moscow were boycotted by Jimmy Carter in the U.S. because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then the Soviets got their revenge in 1984 when they boycotted the Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, which I happened to attend. And then, you had other events, such as in 1996, the Centennial Park bombing at the Olympics in Atlanta, which I also attended. We're never really sure if that was a political act, but there's always been a massive political overlay on these games because they go out to the whole world and it's a propaganda opportunity for all involved.
Now, one thing I am surprised at, Tim, is how little the politicians have jumped on the bandwagon. This really surprises me. I mean, I think it's great that they're not following their natural natures to be opportunistic, but it does concern me when these usually predictable folk do something out of character. Your thoughts?
There's not much currency in the Olympics this year because people don't seem to care much. So it's kind of a vicious circle. Don't play into the Olympics because people don't care about them. but maybe they don't care about them because they're not being played up particularly. But I think people can see there's just a sense that there's just not much buzz, not much chatter around the Olympics, sort of like 2020 in Major League Baseball. Again, I point to the empty stands. You watch these events, and they may be well contested and obviously world-class athletes, but when there's no one in the stands, it detracts from the overall sense of what you're seeing. And it also carries forward the narrative of a world given over to the pandemic. And I think people sort of don't want to be reminded of that. They don't want to be reminded of all of the politics of 2020, including that what I call the summer of shame, where the left just stood by as America burned. So, there's many different reasons for it, but they all add up to a viewership that's substantially less than NBC had hoped for and probably that they expected.
Yeah, I think you're right there, Tim, especially the missing crowds, because when you watch an event at home, it's almost as though the crowd in the amphitheater or in the venue or in the stadium, it's almost like they're your avatars or they're your representatives there, because you're not an athlete, you're not one of the coaches, you're not one of the media people there recording it. So you have somebody in the stadium representing you and you're cheering along with them. And I think, you're absolutely right that not having the crowds, it removes the whole atmosphere of what makes. I mean,
when someone breaks a world record and there's silence, except for a few claps from their teammates, that detracts from the sense that the viewer gets. And we're hoping that in Beijing 2022, the Winter Olympics are only 6 months away. It's got to be the first time in history we've had 2 Olympics within 6 months. They'll be in Beijing in February of 2022, and we'll see whether there'll be fans in the stands and how that might affect the TV ratings.
Would you say that once we eventually come out of the pandemic lockdowns, the shutdowns, once the COVID politics are over, do you think that the Olympics will be more greatly appreciated going forward into the next Olympics? Do you think when the pandemic part's over, do you think that the infusion of politics will still hold people back? Or do you think it'll be a lesson learned?
Post-COVID, the world has changed. COVID's not in the rearview mirror yet, but the Olympics have always held a fascination for the American people. And it should again. Once the pandemic's finally passed, you get people able to go out in public unmasked, and it's a confluence of terrible events in Tokyo because that country was overcome with an outbreak of COVID just as the Olympics were beginning, were getting underway. They were at least going to allow fans in the stands in Japan until 2-3 weeks before, maybe a month, and they had to even get rid of that. I think that would have made a big difference because otherwise it looks like it's being held in a studio. So I think this is a weird time. The world has changed after COVID. It will change after COVID, but I think the Olympics will carry on because it's in the interest of the whole world to continue it. But once again, they have to stop with the politics because that's what will surely drive people away. And we'll see if NBC, for one, has learned that lesson 6 months from now during the Beijing Winter Olympics. We'll see if they're quite so anxious to push political angles and diversity as hard as they pushed it this summer when their ratings have just dropped like a rock.
Tim Donner, thank you ever so much.
Always a pleasure, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. My sincerest thanks go out to our guests this week, Andrew Moran, Jeff Charles, and of course, the longtime host of Liberty Nation Radio, Mr. Tim Donner, and you, the faithful listener. I want to thank you most of all for tuning in and joining us in this tempestuous journey we call the hunt for liberty. We'll be back same place, same time next week for another packed episode. We'll be focusing on all-important Constitution and the amendments that seem to be suffering death by 1,000 cuts. Why are politicians in the Fourth Estate so keen to see Americans stripped of their free speech and their right to bear arms? We'll also be asking the questions about President Joe Biden that much of the media dare not broach. We'll finish with a timely reminder from Charlotte Bronte, author of Jane Eyre, who said, "I'm no bird, and no net ensnares me. I'm a free human being with an independent will." Wise words indeed. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Thank you again for being here. Until next time, I wish you joy and the drive to pursue all that which makes you free.